All right, let's talk a little bit about the brain and movement. Um, so, planning and coordinating of voluntary movements are carried out by and within the central nervous system. Involves the motor areas of the cerebral cortex, the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, and the spinal cord. Three types of neurons directly involved in eliciting muscle contractions. Those are the upper motor neurons, that along with cell bodies in the motor area of the cerebral cortex or the brainstem. These axons descend through the white matter to the brainstem, to the spinal cord, where they synapse with local interneurons. The local interneurons pass the messages from the upper motor neurons to the neighboring lower motor neurons. The cell bodies of the lower motor neurons reside in the anterior horn of the spinal gray matter. The axons then exit the central nervous system to innervate the skeletal muscles. The axons from the cortical motor areas unite to form several white matter tracts. The largest of these tracts are the corticospinal tract, controls muscles below the head and neck, utilizing lower motor neurons of the spinal nerves, and the corticonuclear tract, formerly known as the corticobulbar tracts, which control muscles of the head and neck, utilizing lower motor neurons of the cranial nerves. Axons that form the corticospinal tracts originate from the upper motor neuron cell bodies in the primary motor and premotor cortices. The axons unite and descend through the corona radiata and the internal capsule on way to the brainstem. Most of the fibers decussate at the level of the medullary pyramids. The neurons on the right side of the brain send fibers to the left side of the body and vice versa. That's that cross functioning that we talked about in a couple of videos ago. Fibers that decussate travel in lateral funiculi, known as the right and left lateral corticospinal tracts. The fibers of the lateral corticospinal tracts then synapse on local neurons in the anterior horn of the gray matter. Over half of them terminate in the cervical spinal cord to control motor functions of the upper limbs. 10 to 15% of motor fibers from the cerebrum do not decussate. They travel through the anterior funiculi of the white matter, becoming the right and left anterior corticospinal tracts. And there you see the signal coming from the right side, transversing over to the left side of the brain, signals from the left side transferring over to the right side of the brain. Right and left lateral corticospinal tracts. The corticospinal tracts originate from cell bodies of the upper motor neurons. They travel with the corticospinal tracts through the corona radiata and the internal capsule to the brainstem. They do not enter the spinal cord. Instead, they synapse on interneurons that communicate with the cranial nerve nuclei at various levels within the brainstem. And finally, the cranial nerve nuclei give rise to lower motor neurons that innervate the muscles of the head and neck. These fibers do not decussate, but most cranial nerve nuclei communicate with upper motor neurons from both cerebral hemispheres. Damage to upper motor neurons on one side does not lead to noticeable defects from many cranial nerves. Even simple movements require simultaneous firing of countless neurons as part of a selected group of actions called a motor program. Execution of any motor program requires firing of neurons in that motor association area, firing of upper motor neurons, input from basal nuclei, input from the cerebellum, input from the spinal cord, and multimodal association areas, which are all found in the prefrontal cortex. Firing of lower motor neurons in the peripheral nervous system is necessary to complete any task. The majority of the upper motor neurons that control complex movements reside in the primary motor cortex and the premotor and motor association areas. That is where we plan and initiate any voluntary movement by selecting an appropriate motor program and coordinating a sequence of skilled movements. Upper motor neurons are located in certain nuclei of the brainstem. They work to maintain posture, balance, and body position, especially during locomotion. Also produce motor responses to sensory stimuli. The map of the upper motor neurons in the primary motor cortex and the motor homunculus resemble the sensory map. Homunculus, remember that picture from a previous video of the guy with the great big head and the great big hands? The primary motor cortex is organized somatotopically, where certain body regions have disproportionately more cortical area devoted to them, again, especially the lips, tongue, and hands, which signifies importance of vocalization and manual dexterity to human survival. Again, other animals will have a different map. Upper motor neurons do not act alone when delivering commands to the lower motor neurons. Smooth fluid motion requires the input from both basal nuclei and the cerebellum. And again, there is my view of the homunculus. If you'll notice, again, great big lips, great big tongue, even bigger hands. If you can think back to that previous model. See, here we've got throat, tongue, jaw, face, neck, fingers, hand, wrist, elbow, shoulder. But you start right here. Look how much of this primary motor cortex is devoted to the hands and the mouth. The role of basal nuclei. There are three collections of cell bodies that make up basal nuclei. There's the caudate nucleus, the globus pallidus, and the putamen. This is a series of very complicated interconnections which form a circuit between the basal nuclei and other structures of the brain. There is the substantia nigra, an area of the midbrain that works closely with the basal nuclei. These are usually grouped together because they have shared functions. The basal nuclei modify the activity of the upper motor neurons to produce voluntary movements and inhibit involuntary movements. A critical function of the basal nuclei is to inhibit inappropriate movement. In the absence of voluntary movement, neurons of the globulus pallidus fire continuously to inhibit motor nuclei of the thalamus. Inhibiting the upper motor neurons of cortical motor areas are also inhibit motor neurons from firing. So here's the neurons not stimulated by the thalamus. We got the cerebral cortex, and this is the substantia nigra. If no signal is being sent, then the caudate nucleus doesn't send a signal. The globulus pallidus then inhibits the thalamus, and then the thalamus, we got no signal, so these upper neurons are not stimulated. In initiation of voluntary movement is critical. If a voluntary movement has been initiated, the neurons of the caudate muscles and the putamen receive input from the cerebral cortex, with which they are excitatory synapses. These neurons inhibit the globulus pallidus neurons from firing, which is enhanced by the substantia nigra, increases the output of the caudate nucleus and the putamen. The overall effect is the inhibitor is inhibited, which allows the motor nucleus of the thalamus to fire and stimulate upper motor neurons, which enables motion. The neurons of the substantia nigra are dopaminergic, I'll get it out in a minute, which means they secrete dopamine. Why couldn't they just say that they secrete dopamine and throw in a word in there I can't say? These project to the caudate nucleus and the putamen, where dopamine enhances the inhibitory output to the globulus pallidus. The input in the substantia nigra is vital for initiating movement. So we have input from the cerebral cortex, input from the substantia nigra. The caudate muscles and the putamen then inhibit the globulus pallidus. No signal being sent, then the thalamus stimulates upper motor neurons and we have voluntary movement. Damage to any component of the basal nuclei system results in a movement disorder. The inability to initiate voluntary movement is one of those forms. And this makes simple activities such as walking or talking very difficult. The ability to inhibit inappropriate involuntary movements, some of which are mild, such as throat clearing or blinking. Others may be severe enough to cause disability. Think of Tourette's syndrome, where people will, have the jerking sensation. Oftentimes, they will blurt out words that are completely inappropriate. So again, here is the absence of voluntary movement, so no signal being sent, so there's no signal sent, which inhibits the thalamus, so no movement. Here we get a stimuli, which inhibits this, so now we don't get a signal being sent, so the thalamus initiates voluntary movement. The cerebellum monitors all of the ongoing movements and integrates information about contraction and relaxation of muscles, the position of joints, direction, force, and type of movement that is going to occur. Once information is integrated, the cerebellum determines the motor error, or the difference between the intended movement and the actual movement that is taking place. The cerebellum then influences other regions of the brain to reduce error, can occur over a short or long term by what is called motor learning. Correction to motor errors are added over time to the motor program. More repetition of a specific action, more corrections for the motor error added to the program, more fluid and error-free motion becomes the norm. Think about when your little toddler first learned to walk. At first, they were very unsteady, but then after they did it a little while, and it just seems like almost overnight, they go from barely even being able to walk from the coffee table to the couch to running across the room at a rate that you can't hardly keep up with them. The cerebellum receives input from 3 sources simultaneously. The motor areas of the cerebral cortex via the upper motor neurons, the vestibular nuclei signals come from the pons, and the ascending sensory tracts from the spinal cord. The motor areas then provide information on intended movement. The vestibular nuclei and ascending tracts supply data on actual movement. And the cerebellar neurons process and integrate input from both sources, which send output to correct motor error, primarily to upper motor neurons via the premotor cortex and primary motor cortex. Like the basal nuclei, the cerebellum affects movement by modifying the activity of upper motor neurons. The cerebellum does not have direct connections with lower motor neurons. Damage to the cerebellum makes fluid, well-coordinated movement nearly impossible. Movements become jerky and inaccurate in a condition called cerebellar ataxia. And again, roles of the brain in voluntary movement. Here's the signal coming in, interpreted here, goes here where an association is made. That association is passed along over here. The signal comes back down where the signal is then adjusted. Parkinson's disease is one of the most common movement disorders, called hypokinetic. Term hypokinetic means that the movement is difficult to initiate, and once it's started, it's difficult to terminate. Folks who suffer from Parkinson's disease have minimal facial expression. They have a shuffling gait, usually with no associated arm swing. Most of us swing our arms when we walk. Folks with Parkinson's have a resting tremor. In other words, their hands are shaking almost all the time. Many of them have difficulty swallowing, and then very rigid movements of the arms and legs. The cause of Parkinson's is still largely unknown. We know that a degeneration of dopamine secreting neurons of the substantia nigra plays a role, and we know that it progresses over 10 to 20 years. The underlying mechanism, however, is unknown, but genetics is suspected in approximately 10% of cases. The treatment for Parkinson's is medications that increase the levels of dopamine in the brain to compensate for the decreased level brought about by the disease. And there is the big picture of the brain and the central nervous system control of voluntary movement. Signals come in, signals are associated and interpreted, signal comes down to the particular muscle that is needed to make the movement occur. That concludes chapter 12. I will pick up with chapter 13 at some other time. I will get these posted today, and then you will be free to watch them at your leisure. Have a good rest of your day.